Hello and welcome to Tales from the Hut and Hangar. This one's with Rick Lee, so it's Volume 1, Chapter 2. We're currently at Middlezoy Aerodrome. We've driven down from Weston-super-Mare. It's nice and quiet, a bit of background noise. Hopefully no kids will be playing in the background this time. So you want to listen to the first part, it's available on the channel. There's links, or just have a look through it. And we're just going to go into more detail this time with Rick about some of the stories he wants to tell. But we're probably going to focus on ejections, ejector, banging out, whatever you want to call it. So, hello Rick.
Hello Keith.
Right, let's have a recap from the last one, right? So we said about you think about the most robust aircraft or dependable aircraft that you thought you ever existed, come across, went in, whatever. So what's your answer to that one?
Well, I thought about it a lot, but I never flew this aeroplane. I've always wanted to, I'd love to have flown it. I was flying Hunters in the Far East at the time, and we had a visit by 4 F-105 Thunder Chiefs, and they were up in Vietnam dropping bombs on the Chinese. And these guys arrived at Hangar, and they parked them next to our Hunters, and they were absolutely huge. And I'd read about them and seen them as a boy, and I thought the shape and the way that they'd been developed into what they could do, which is carry thousands of bombs and go very fast, almost 800 knots on the deck, which is quite amazing. But the thing that really surprised me was the condition of the aeroplanes. There was one which had a hole through the wing. It was about the size of a 2 6-penny piece. About an inch across.
Was that a bullet hole or something?
It was, yes, it was shrapnel or something, and it didn't go into anything that needed fixing on the inside. And you could look right through the wing, this hole, and they didn't bother to fix it. And the cockpits had sort of jungle green fudge and bits of mud in the bottom, and well, not mud, but fungi growing behind the ejection seats. And they were basically in the conditions in Vietnam and in the rain and everything like that. But they were thoroughly serviceable, and we did a couple of high-low highs onto the Thai border with them as escorts for our 4 Hunters. And flying alongside one of these massive beasts and letting down into the target area, we were about to be attacked, our 6 aeroplanes, by 2 more Hunters from our own squadron. So we had these 2 F-105s on our 4-ship formation of little Hunters going in to attack this target in the jungle. And we did our thing. We'd briefed the F-105 pilots, but they were a little bit confused about being attacked by anybody on the ground. And of course, what happened was, as we ran in to pull up to attack our target with the overhead cover of these 2 F-105s, their job was to shoot them down with missiles or guns. The 2 aeroplanes came in to attack us, and we started whizzing around the jungle at about 150 feet with 8 aeroplanes, and we all wanted pictures of the F-105s, so we all started tucking into the F-105s, and they suddenly realized that they couldn't protect us, they just couldn't turn quick enough, and they said, "Whoa, we're getting out of here," and they hit their burners and went up to about 30,000 feet in, God knows, a short space of time. They weren't carrying weapons. Anyway, and that was fun, and they thought it was great. And of course, this was before the Americans went into red flag and the pilots that they did in Tom Cruise, where they learned how to fight at low level. And I remember on the debrief, and they just didn't quite know what was going on just above the jungle treetops. And they were in a real war, dropping weapons on the Chinese. But they said, "God, if we had 150 of your little Hunters, we could have won the war last week." Which was something. But the aeroplane itself was so rugged and such a fantastic looking machine. I've always wanted to fly one, but of course they've gone now.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, referring to the last podcast we did, I must stop saying "so" all the time. Michael Parkinson died today. Did you know that?
You're kidding me.
Yeah, there's an interviewer.
What?
Yeah.
You're replacing him, are you?
I'm not replacing him, but I did say "so" a lot. But your errors, you've got to tell the listeners your mix-up between Trump.
Oh yes, my first podcast. Oh, how wonderful! And when I said I was flying as a glider, a young guy in the age of 14 or 15. And I said my instructor's name was Trump. Because I've been watching lots and lots of stuff on YouTube of Mr. Trump. In fact, the name of my first pilot I flew with as an ATC cadet was Crump, which I thought was quite good for a first pilot and a glider. So it was a Pilot Officer Crump was my first one. So that was my first mistake. And the other one was, what was it, Keith? I can't remember.
Biggles.
Oh, Biggles, yes. The gentleman that I was flying Tiger Moths with is in South Australia, and I met in Alice Springs. His name was Boggles. I was obviously Biggles, because Biggles was that guy in after the war. There was a guy in the RAF whose name was Biggles, and he kept making mistakes. And I remember that as a child. Now, the reason he was called Boggles is quite fun. I had a girlfriend in Alice Springs, and she wanted to fly in the Tiger Moth. And I went down to see this Mr. Boggles at the airfield with his lady friend, and he had a big F-250 and a Caravan, and there was his Tiger Moth, and I didn't know him from Adam, and I thought, what a wonderful name, Boggles. I was flying Cessnas and balloons and things there, so I wasn't looking for a job at that stage. But anyway, I said, oh, hello, Mr. Boggles, what have you got for my young lady? And he said, well, you can have $50 or you can have $100, and for $100 you can do a mind boggler. And I said, what's that? He said, I go up to 3,000 feet and I come down cutting one of these. And he handed a toilet roll, and he'd climbed up to 3,000 feet, and I'd sort of seen it before, but not quite done like this. We were in the middle of a huge airfield at Alice Springs, quite early in the morning. There was no airliners coming in. It was quite an unused airfield, really. And he climbed up with this young lady in the front seat. And at about 2,500, 3,000 feet, he did a loop, and out came the toilet roll. And it spread down through the sky, obviously, and then, but in a series of wing overs and whizzing through, he cut it. And he must have cut, I'm counting the number of streaks of this rather large toilet roll. And they were all fluttering down to the airfield.
That's from the early days of flying. They did that.
Yeah,
They did the streamer cutting. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, they did, didn't they? Anyway, he cut the last one at about 100 feet. It was really, really superb flying, and he landed. And he said that's a mind boggler, and it was called a mind boggler.
That explains that.
And unfortunately, when I joined him a year later, I was never allowed to do the mind boggler. It was one thing that Boggles kept, and I was very annoyed about it.
Right, so we've addressed our errors in the first one, but
Right.
we are more professional this time.
Of course.
You might hear a windmill going outside and the flagpole rattling, but it adds a bit of atmosphere and ambience as we're sat in our
Correct.
Nissan hut by the hangar. Right, aircraft nicknames. I'll tell you the story of this. I've always found aircraft nicknames really funny, and there's a list on www.b737.org.uk, which is not on there at the moment, but luckily I saved the list. So I'm just going to read a few funny ones out, which, you know, lighten the mode before
To make the audience laugh. Is that
well,
the idea?
again, we're getting pretty heavy in a bit, aren't we?
Oh, we are.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Right then, so, okay, there's a massive list of every kind of aircraft you could dream of. I don't know how many it is, it's about 5 pages. But I just highlighted the ones that made me laugh today. Right. For starters, A320, common aircraft. Sully's Ark. Okay, yeah. Right, the next one, A380, flying forehead. It's got a big head, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's quite clever. Now, the 146...
A bit like yours, Keith.
Yeah, that's right, shut up.
Right.
Anyway, sorry about him forgetting the names, because he's getting on a bit. I'll get one back there. So the 146, apparently on this website, and the 73's got the most names, but they say they're the most endearing aircraft.
The 146?
Yeah, the BA146.
Oh, right.
You know, the A4 engines,
Oh,
hair
that
drive.
goes into London Airport by the...
But someone calls it the Fisher-Price 747. That's a good one.
Yeah.
So hang on, bear with me, folks. I might put this up as a link somewhere or post this because they are brilliant.
The Fisher-Price.
The bit of Norman Islander, Trilander rather, the Trilander.
Yes, I know it well.
Clockwork TriStar. There's hundreds of these, but these are just harsh, negative engineers made a lot of these up, and
You're going to get a lot of thumbs down from these people.
Pissy pilots, I expect, saying, "I hate the bloody thing." Starfire, the pregnant hairpin. Sorry, the pregnant hat pin.
Hat pin.
It works both ways.
I've flown twice in one of those.
Which it looks like. Hang on, there's a few more. The Metroliner, the Metroliner,
Yes.
long skinny thing.
Yeah.
San Antonio sewer pipe. And that's got loads here. They are really bad. The turbo dildo, terror tube, that noisy effing thing. Texas Lawn Dark. They got millions. It's just, again, you've
Where
got the
did you get all
lovely
these
short Skyvan and short 360. I obviously called the Shed, but the Shed one, this is good. The Whispering Nissan Hut for the Skyvan.
The little Skyvan.
Yeah, a little Skyvan. The short 360, obviously known as the Shed, the Irish Concorde. Hope we didn't offend anyone with that. That's it for now. So what? You did mention the Tornado, which made me chuckle. I know that one before.
Yeah, MRCA.
So what's another one of your favourites? You can
the
think
Mother
of?
Riley's cardboard aeroplane.
Yeah,
mean?
that's.
Yeah. It's,
Any more you can think of?
no, not offhand. Certainly not.
Okay, think on that one for the next one.
I'll think
all
of
right?
some funny names. Yes.
Right, so we're going to move on. I'm not going to say so. I'm going to say, right then, in Parky style.
Yeah.
Our next subject, Rick's main things and the things that always fascinate me about any chats we have when he's had a few beers, and the detail and the sheer luck and skill and what a wonderful work Martin Baker have done with the seats. I wanted to tell one or two of his yarns if he can be bothered. We set up the scene. He's flying along in an aeroplane. Over to you, Rick.
Thank you, Keith. Are we going to stop making love now? Or we just, yes. Okay, I'll start talking. Okay, what you want to say is that I've ejected twice. Is that right? And
exactly.
do you want me to talk about both of them?
We'll go for the first one. See how long that goes on before we can always go back to it.
The first one was in 1979, and I was flying a Jaguar for the Sultan of Oman's Air Force. I was a seconded weapons instructor who had just recently come into the squadron, 8th Squadron at Thumr 8, which is down the bottom half of Oman, about 70 miles from the border with Yemen, who were the baddies. There were hunters there. There was a hunter squadron, which is 6th Squadron, and I was on 8th Squadron Jaguars. At that time, there were no Omani pilots that were flying the Hunter or the Jaguar. There was about to receive a Hunter pilot, Omani, who had been up at Madeira flying Jet Provost and a couple of flights in the UK, I think. But I never actually got to fly with the Omani people. As you probably know now, Oman has got F-16s and other airfields up and down, and it is a very important part.
They're a very capable Air Force, aren't they now? I think
They're a very capable Air Force. Of course, they've been trained by the Brits.
Okay, then. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Anyway, so I joined there. I was sort of headhunted. God knows, my head's big enough. But anyway, there was a guy called Eric Bennett, and he was the air commander. He was, if you like, a flying... what's the name of the guy with that lovely white turban who was on a camel who went and fought?
Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence of Arabia, that's his guy. He was a flying Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. He was first job. He was a hunter pilot in the 50s. He did all the right things, and he got a job as a wing commander, I believe, with Hussein of Jordan. King Hussein of Jordan with his English wife, and they were very close, and he went over there to instruct on the hunters and to basically set up an air force with the Jordanians. And this would have been in the early 70s, something like that. I knew him in the late 60s as a wing commander in charge of operations in, I'll get the dates right, I'm sorry. He was actually in Jordan in the late 60s, and I met him just as he arrived at Tenga as a wing commander ops after that complete destruction of the Jordanian Air Force by the Israelis. And they attacked the airports and the airfields, and they destroyed, as you probably all know, the Egyptians and everybody else by flying over in their Mirages and other jets, and they destroyed the whole of the Arab air forces and won the war. Well, I'll get on to the ejection and how he saved my life. Not only did he know me flying Lightnings in the Far East, and I remember taking a picture of him, and he already had been checked out in a Lightning years before when they first came out. but he never actually did frontline lightning flying. But when I was on 74 Squadron, he did come over and we let him fly after a quick checkout in the T5. So he flew the Lightning, but he was a Wing Commander Ops. He had a beautiful Ferrari given to him by the King Hussein.
Nice.
And he used to drive into town, and we all used to try and find out where he went, but we never did. But he was a super guy, quite small, very, very firm in his decisions, and a great guy to be around.
Good leader then, basically.
He was a great leader, yeah. Anyway, he knew me there when I was a Lightning pilot, and years later, when I'd done 2 more tours on Lightnings and a tour on Hunters and a tour on Jaguars, all of a sudden I was basically qualified to teach on the Jaguar weaponeering, and I was coming to the end of my career. I was going to leave the Air Force after another 2 years and go to Australia and take my wife and children to Australia. And in that last tour, as I was penultimate one, I was asked if I would like to go to Oman, and they wanted a weapons instructor, and I'd just done the course, and I couldn't wait to get out there. It was all sort of brewing up a little bit. It had been going since the late 50s for 20 years, and they'd had all sorts of aeroplanes, but now they had a squadron of Hunters and a squadron of Jaguars down at Thumnate near the enemy. The Jaguars had been there for about a year, and if you know anything about Oman, Sultan Qaboos, every year he celebrated on November the 10th, I think it was, his taking over the country from his father, who was a bit of a recluse, and he locked everybody up, a bit of a Putin actually, and he wouldn't let people do the right thing. Anyway, Qaboos took over. He'd gone through Sandhurst, and he knew a lot of the SAS guys, and they were the guys that went in the early 70s with Strike Masters, and then the Hunters, and now we had the Jaguars. So we arrived there, and almost within a couple of weeks of me being checked out, I arrived up in Muscat because it had the November the 10th celebration of I think it was his 10th year into his rule. And Eric Bennett was very close to this man as well. He could speak Arabic, he'd learnt it in Jordan, so they were quite a good pair. He recently died, Eric Bennett, and so, as we know, as Sultan Qaboos. So anyway, went up there, I met him again, and he said, "Welcome, Rick," and we flew the formation, all the Jaguars, all the Hunters, and all the Strike Masters over this huge stadium, and we had a fantastic party in the Sultan's Palace, quite amazing, little guys running around with turbans on, with nice sweetmeats and orange juice, because there was no alcohol, right? Well, he had 2 palaces, one in the north and one in the south, not Eric, but the Q, Qaboos. And it was about 500 miles away by road down to Salalah, where he had another palace. He didn't like flying, the Sultan. He would only go everywhere in 6 limousines, and you never knew which one he was in. And one of our jobs was to actually fly alongside up at 20,000 feet as he came down every year to visit his palace in the south, where he had horses. Now, to get to this ejection, well, shortly after I arrived, and it was obvious to me then that Eric had brought somebody in that had already used the laser on the Jaguar. They hadn't used them on the squadron there, the 5 guys that were there, and they were all mercenaries. Don't get me wrong, they won't walk along with beards and long, like we see the mercenaries in Ukraine, but they were ex-RAF pilots that had flown the Jaguar, and they then left the Air Force and joined the SOAF.
Right.
And so I was the only seconded officer there, along with Eric. There were 2 of us. And the rest were mercenaries, but good mates. And shortly after arriving, we come back down from north, from the display for King Qaboos, Eric phoned up, and the boss said to me, "Rick, Eric." And I said, "Good morning, sir." He said, "Rick, I want you to do a trial for me using the laser in the Jaguar." And I said, "Oh, great. When?" He said, "In a month." And I went, "Okay, what do I have to do?" And he said, we're going to buy 4 laser markers, the ones you put on your shoulders. I didn't know about these, but they did have them, for people like the SAS to look for a target in the desert. They can see them with their binoculars, but it was very difficult using what we call forward air control, where they talk to you in the air in your Hunter at 20,000 feet above missile range, and they say your target's by that bushy tree, by the lake, by the house. Yes, you're on the right heading. Of course, they couldn't do that in the desert.
No.
So what they needed was something to highlight the enemy, which could be a Land Rover hidden behind a sand dune or in a cave or just in a ditch. And the baddies were there. They killed four of our ground crew. The ground crew went to a lake. This is the Adu. And the Adu was supplied by people in Yemen, communist inspired, giving them money and all sorts of things to oppose the Sultan Qaboos. And they'd been coming over the border for years. And the SAS got it pretty well numbered now. The strike masters, you might remember the attack near Salalah, where they drove them into the desert, and quite a few people were killed in the SAS. Mirbat, that was called, and I'm sure it's well worth a read. But they were still killing. If you went anywhere in Oman, in the southern part of Oman, without weapons, and I was issued, I went and picked up an Armalite, 38 and a 9mm. You could have as many weapons as you like, about 3 or 4 most, and you'd keep them in your car. So everywhere you went, if you went into Salalah, which was 50 miles away on the coast, and you went through the desert and through the hills and down the big harif, the escarpment, you always carried weapons. And if they saw you without weapons, they might have had a go. And that's what they did to these ground crew, the air work. They went to the same waterhole at the weekend. They were not issued with weapons. However, they did come to us before they went to work the weekend and borrow things between you, me, and the gatepost. But they went round this little waterhole, which was up to the edge of the escarpment, twice on the trot, I think it was. And at night, round about 1 o'clock in the morning, I think it was, the goat herdsman, which has got his weapon in plastic underneath a rock, they opened up on them. We don't know how many there were, and they killed 3 outright, and one guy dived into the pool, and the next morning he raised the hue and cry, but it was too late for us to get there and find out where they'd gone. So they were basically Adu, and they had weapons, and they used them if they had a chance. So anyway, it was important that the SAS had got this laser marker so we could do FAC, forward air controlling, without being in range of their missiles, which they were Russian ones were given. And the idea was to set up a range with 5 targets. So I went out into the desert in my Land Rover with tubes of paper, and I made 5 targets, set up about 3 or 4 kilometers away from our RSO subs, the range safety officer. Now, we used to go out there regularly and practice strafing with our 30mm cannon and dropping 500-pound Pakistani bombs. These bombs were all stored.
So what was the landscape like? Was it very flat, or was there
The actual range was just off the runway. It was very flat on the bit that we were. Thumb rate was 15,000 feet long. It was a huge runway, and it was used as a standby for the space shuttle, which was flying around the world.
Oh, right, okay.
Coming back. So, and there was another one in Australia, and there was around the world. The Americans had put these standby places where, in friendly countries, where they could get the shuttle in if they wanted to.
Yeah.
So anyway, this big runway, it's a flat area, and we could drive for 2 miles outside the camp, turn left through a couple of sand dunes, and we were in our range. It was called Rub Cut Range. It's about 10 square miles, and we used to go and take out Land Rovers and old trucks and put them in a line, and then go out and strafe them and drop these 500-pound bombs on them, and just keep our hand in on the weapons. The bombs were not carried above 450 knots. They were used on the strike masters, and we were told not to go faster than 450 knots with them. They have a little propeller on the front that does the arming fuse. The fuses were all contact fuses. In other words, they hit the ground before they go off. There was no airburst fuses in them. So the fuses were wound into the front with a little propeller, and there's a pin put in, and that pin is attached through the pylon into the top of the bomb. And you could drop them live or safe. And in the cockpit, you could have a little switch, and if you put it safe, the actual bomb dropped off with the pin still in the propeller, so it would hit in the desert and not go off. And the Vicky Verky, if you put live, the pin was removed, the propeller immediately went round 50 or 60 times, and the bomb was armed. Now, if you're flying at 400 knots and it's armed, the moment you drop that bomb, the propeller is round and it's armed. The next thing is it only goes off when it hits the ground. Right. Well, that was the plan.
Yeah.
On this particular day, I went out there to demonstrate it. The Sultan of Oman had sent out, he didn't come down, but he sent his chief accountant, 2 SAS guys, and a couple of other people, and they arrived in 2 Iroquois helicopters on the morning at 9 o'clock. I'd spent a week putting up 5 targets that were hidden, that you couldn't see them without a pair of binoculars from the RSO's hut. They were about 3 or 4 kilometers beyond the normal strafing area where we did our normal training, and the only way that you could see them behind this sandbag, which was on these 2 circular dunes overlooking this stretch of desert, was by saying, pick one of the targets, and the Arab would say, which one? And you'd say, well, here's the binoculars, pick one of the 5, and they'd flick it up and he'd say, that one over there. And he could only see it in binoculars, and then the SAS guy would point the laser marker at that target. Meanwhile, I'm well above, and then we had 2 aeroplanes. I picked a young guy called Simon Wilborn, and he's got ginger beard, and a young man that was kicked out of the Air Force at Hunter training because of OQs, but he was a brilliant pilot. And he was out there on the squadron. And I picked Simon to be my number 2. We set up the aeroplanes the night before. We had a spare aeroplane, and we had 5 bombs on each, 1 on the center line and 1 on each pylon, 2 under the left wing and 2 on the right wing. We took off when we heard that the helicopters had landed behind the sand dunes and that they were ready in the RSO's hut, which was about the size of half of a squash court, with, well, even less than that, a quarter of a squash court, like 1 corner of a squash court, surrounded by sandbags that you could duck behind if the bombs got too close, but these bombs were going to land some distance away. And the idea was to go up there speechless, so no RT was called, because the Arabs used to listen, the Adu, and then on timing, or the flash of a light, or just a pip of a button, at a certain time, or on a time, I would tip into the desert 4 or 5 miles below. I was at 20,000 feet, so
I'm quite high then.
Yeah, quite high. And of course, the desert from up there doesn't
look any different.
Just desert, right?
Yeah.
And these targets were well to the left of the RSO's hut. A quick explanation of the computer, but in the screen, you had a small gun sight, which you can see in most modern fighters now, which it was smaller than the average one that we see in the Eurofighter and all these latest things, F-22.
Was it like green lit? Was it?
Yeah, it's light green lettering and numbers. Yeah. And what happened is you tipped down the dive, you selected the number that the guy with the thing on his shoulder down in the RSOs, and this was number 1. So 1 was the figure, not 2, 3, or 4. And as soon as you tipped your aeroplane down into the desert area with the 5 targets all spread over the place, he would pick one, or get the Arab to pick one, but after a bit, the first 2 were done by the army. And what would happen, you'd have an R which was flashing in the gun sight ahead of you. As soon as you tipped down and it picked up the reflected energy of the target that the target market was fitting, right, it would then jump onto that and go steady. And in the gun sight at 20,000 feet, it covered a lot of sky. So the little R that was flashing in the middle would probably go about 2 or 3 inches, and that was the target. I'd then turn the aeroplane. One had to physically turn the aeroplane, and at the same time, the laser was rebounding the energy off that target, even though it was quite small, and giving the computer on board, which knew the ballistics of the bomb, the speed that I was flying at, and my height above the ground, because I had a radio altimeter. And as you'll know from school geometry, with all that information, it can actually release the bomb at the speed that we know it's doing, yeah, and get near the target. It was never going to hit the target unless it was lucky, but it would be within cooey of it, let's say 30 meters. Yeah. And that was enough to prove one of the 5 targets was being attacked without saying anything. So by just pointing this thing at this target in the desert, the bomb would land near it. And it worked fine. I tipped in on time, and the little R was flashing, it jumped. I then tracked the CCIP line, the computer impact point, continuously computed impact point, CCIP, and there's a sort of wobbly line that tells you where your weapon or your gun bullets that you're firing is going to hit the ground, because it's actually superimposed. So you turn towards the target, and this little line comes up automatically and touches the point that releases the bomb that will enable it to hit the target. So it's not a laser guided bomb, it's a laser computed, if you like, using all the things.
What sort of speed do you go in at?
I tip in at round about 400 knots.
Oh, right, really fast then.
It's fast, yeah. And you start going down the hill, bearing in mind 450 knots was the maximum. So as you're going downhill, you don't need a lot of power because you're actually accelerating. So as you tip in round about 400 knots, we were doing, we'd throttle back and we'd go down the dive, just tracking the CCIP line to the R. And then you press the button. It's electronic. It goes to the first bomb, which was underneath in the middle of the Jaguar, and you could feel it. And it's electronic, and it sets off an electrical device which sends off a cartridge, like a 12-bore cartridge, if you like, in the pylon, which opens a couple of little hooks on the top of the bomb. There's a little ridge there, and it pushes some stainless steel bolts inside that bomb thing, push the bomb away to get it away from the aerodynamics of the aeroplane. The center line, there's not much going on there, but on the wings, it's important that it pushes it a long way away. And I did that as Simon went round and dropped his bomb, and everything was going fine. On my last bomb, the bomb unfortunately came off early because of a computer error. I reset it. It had happened to me in England. It were early days on the Jaguar kit, and it wasn't perfect. And I reset it and decided to do my last attack, which was the left-hand bomb. The sequence of bombs, if you were dropping one at a time, was center, inboard right, inboard left, outboard right, and outboard left. So there's your 5 bombs. So the last bomb was going to be the one on the left. The one on the right dropped early, 600 yards early, and I told them that because there was a computer error. I lifted up, climbed up, went round again, and I set myself up for a manual attack. And on this attack, the things that I did in the cockpit was I turned the green writing up, because remember, this was going to be a press button thing. I had to simulate that computer endpoint as it climbed up the CCIP line. So what I did was I put my visor up, I pulled the sun visor up, and I leaned forward onto the ejection seat and moved a lever on the right, which enabled me to lean forward so I could get my face right up at the green writing, if you like. It was no longer cool. You can see there, with the helmet down. And I selected manual on the release point. I tipped in. I was determined to get my last bomb as a good one, which was on the left. Simon's bombs were going well, so one bomb had dropped 600 yards short through the computer error. As I went down the hill, watching the CCIP line, as the little 90-degree line on the CCIP line, just before it approached the R, if I hadn't pickled before it approached the R, it would have been null and void, and I wouldn't have been able to release. So I'm going to go now. So I pressed slightly early, and as I pressed, there was an incredible bang, and the bomb came off. I felt the Yahoo go, and then almost immediately, the airplane was blown apart. The shrapnel from the bomb, which was about 14 feet underneath the wing, I'll tell you how they found that out, spread out in an angle of 45 degrees. It chopped the cockpit off, where there's a fuel tank just behind the cockpit. It chopped through that, and it chopped through just before the fin in front of the 2 engines, the 2 doors at the back. And the rest of the airplane, apart from the starboard wing, which was on the other side, obviously, was just shrapnel, and it was just blown apart. The cockpit immediately caught fire. It was built as a trainer, so it had 100% oxygen inside the cockpit. So very similar to those poor people in the space shuttle that, not the space shuttle, I'm sorry, but the what are they those guys in the three astronauts in the little cabin?
Apollo.
Yeah, Apollo. They were in an oxygen-rich environment with a small spark. So all it needed was a small spark. Well, it had a big fire going on. And so the tube of oxygen going up to my mask was blown into my right arm, and that then blew the mask off. And that tube lit about 3,500 degrees C, and it just burnt. I put the hands in front of my face and screamed for a bit, which was good because it stopped the flames going down my throat, and that would have killed me. My right arm was sucked out into the slipstream, and the cockpit, I don't think it tumbled. I think it flew by itself for a bit in this massive fireball with me squeaking. And then when I realized the bomb had gone off, strangely enough, and I reached down with my left hand. I'm left-handed, and I managed to find the handle. I was in the cockpit in this huge fireball, shaking. It was like you could imagine a great white shark biting you and shaking you. The pain was unique. It was just unbelievable, and very, very bright light. And I covered my face with my hands. My gloves were burnt off, but at that stage of the game, as you'll find out, we weren't sure. Everybody said I wasn't wearing gloves, but it took about 2 seconds to burn the gloves off. They were Cape leather, and all the sleeves on the flying suit was gone. The Mae West was starting to melt, and the top of the helmet, the actual visor itself was melting plastic. It hadn't gone completely, and the bone dome itself was burnt. I found this out later. Anyway, I managed to get the handle, and I went out of the cockpit. And it was when you eject, your head is forced forward. The go forward lever will bring your shoulders back. But before it did that, my head went down to the right of the control column because I had that little lever back and locked. And I remember the control column going past my face, my head down, and then my shoulders were brought back by the ejection seat harness system, and then I was forced to watch as the seat fired for about half a second, I think, the 4 little rockets, and they send you up 300 feet. And I remember seeing the cockpit tumbling forward, and then the parachute opens almost immediately if you're below that certain height, and your head's drawn away then, and I was freezing, and I remember dropping down with all this white stuff.
So what altitude was this at?
I tipped in at 20,000, and I think it was probably getting towards 15. It was a bit later than the others. I sort of was tracking a bit, and I'd gone a bit closer, I think, to make sure the bomb went off in the range. So it was probably around about 13,000 feet. And then I just drifted down. There was a 25-knot wind blowing on the range, which was very strong. It didn't make any difference with a computer, so I didn't have to allow for that on my attacks, because it was still laser marked. And I drifted down, knowing that I should be doing something about, looking down and things, but I was so shocked and wondering what all this white stuff was. I can't remember being in pain at that stage, but it came quite quickly after that.
Here comes a recovery helicopter.
Oh yes, coming in here. Anyway, so I hit the ground very hard. Both my chucker boots, I wasn't wearing the correct boot. We went out of the desert quite a bit, and I was wearing a pair of blue chucker boots, which I'd bought from a shop in Norwich years before. I loved them. It had a little patch on the side of the outside of each ankle where you could put a contraceptive or 25p or something. Anyway, it was orange laces, and they were lovely for walking in the desert. But one of them came off in the cockpit, and the other one came off just before when I was being dragged by this 25-knot wind. Anyway, I hit the ground, which is incredibly hard, and was dragged by the parachute. Oh, I don't know, 25 yards, I suppose, and I was trying to turn the box and bang it, but I couldn't. Because I couldn't grip it, which I didn't know. It was skin that was making it difficult. So in the end, I did what you should have done anyway, which was put your thumbs underneath and then squeeze it. And the parachute sort of blew away, and I stopped on my back, stood up, and my helmet, and I looked around. I realized that I was, quite badly burnt at that stage. My face had even then was starting to swell slightly. So my vision, even in that space of time, I knew my face was burnt, and I could hear the explosions of the ammunition of the strafe bullets going off about a mile away towards the RSO set. And I knew the helicopters were there. I didn't know if they'd seen me, and I tried to raise my arms to wave to them, but I found it hurt, so I didn't. And I tried to walk out a little bit into the desert to wave, but I couldn't because my feet were no shoes on my feet. So it was all a bit and then I took my helmet off and I was going to drop it to the ground, and I had one of these watches that had an electrical, it opened up, steel, and it slid onto my hand, and I put my hand out like that and flung it into the desert.
So did you feel any pain, or were you just running on adrenaline?
The pain started about then.
Right, okay, yeah.
The first pain I felt was when my watch went into my skin. About 3 months later, a pilot, the guy that went round behind me, Simon Wilborn, walked into a burns ward in England with a pencil with this watch, this Seiko watch, covered in black crap, which was skin, and he'd gone out in the desert and he found it. He said, "Rick, is this yours?" I was then a sort of a grunting patient, wanker, or whatever, right? Anyway, so that was Simon. It was good fun, and I sort of waved. And the strange thing is, and here's the funny bit, but without Eric being there in his helicopter, I would be buried in the desert somewhere. I would probably have died of shock. Anyway, so there was a SAS guy that had a 35mm camera, and he was taking pictures of the explosions in the desert. On that last one, all they heard was a bang, but it wasn't in front of them. It was 2 miles away, up in the air.
Yeah.
And he turned to the left, he heard the bang, and he took 5 pictures. This first picture is of the actual cockpit in a huge fireball. It's 150 foot long. I measured it with the ejection seat coming out of it just above in mid-burn. The next picture he took was when it slowed down from 400 knots and the cockpit's dropping below the 2 engines. The third picture was a smoke ring. At this stage again, nobody knew. He certainly didn't say to them, "Oh, he's up there," because they didn't know what had happened until this big smoke ring went up and somebody said, "It's an aeroplane," or what's left of it, the cockpit. And it landed quite close to the RSO set, just beyond the normal strafing area. And then they realized, and he looked to the left and he saw a parachute. So he'd taken the ejection seat actually moving, then the dropping, the smoke ring. And at this stage again, somebody realized that the airplane had blown up.
Yeah.
And they all looked out to the left, and somebody said, "There he is." And there was this orange and white parachute about 4 miles downwind, being blown at 25 knots. I was probably, I've got a picture of all these, about, I don't know, 500 feet, just about to hit the desert.
Well, I'll just say that we're going to come back to Rick and probably do a video and show some of these pictures from his album, so you can see this actual photograph in reality.
Cool. Well, I'll stop talking about that then.
No, that's fine. No, but it's descriptive.
So the thing that I did was, God, I didn't know they'd seen me. And I thought, this is nuts, right? And I'm standing there, didn't want to raise it, and I thought, I'm going to have to sit down. I tried to sit down, and I couldn't, so I stood up. It hurt to sit down. So, and then I saw a helicopter from behind the sand dunes at one of the VIPs, and it came whizzing downwind, turned round into wind, as you would, incredible sand blowing everywhere, not over me, thank God. He was over on my right there, 2 o'clock, pitching into about 80 yards away. Out jumps, I realised when he got closer, was Eric Bennett. And there was a guy behind him, a guy with a big moustache who was the crewman. He stayed at the helicopter. And Eric sort of run and jogged towards me, standing there looking at him. And he's quite small. He was about 5 or 6 inches lower than me, or maybe not that much. But I looked down at him and I said, "Eric, that could have killed me." And because he'd insisted that I use those bombs, it was a bit of a joke. He just didn't say anything. He never touched me or said anything. I think when I went back, he told me, he said, "Rick, do you remember what you said that day?" And I went, "No," because I never called him Eric. I always called him Sir, right?
Yeah.
And he said, "You said, Eric, that could have killed me. I thought it was the understatement of the century." It was really funny, really. So anyway, he didn't touch me because at that stage of the game, I hadn't realised he'd seen burnt pilots during the Hunter.
Yeah, his experience.
Destroyed, and he knew that touching was going to hurt. So I wobbled over to the helicopter, jumped in. The crewman was a lovely man. He was a chieftain's son in his 30s, and he had this big beard. And I sat in the back. This crewman sat on the right. Eric hadn't touched me. I was shoeless and pretty well nothing much on my anywhere, and sat there leaning forward, which didn't hurt so much. My back of my neck was burnt, my forehead was burnt, and the whole face was burnt. And I was losing sight. My eyes were obviously closing, but I could still see. And the helicopter took off immediately and turned right towards Thumb Rate, which was only 3 minutes, well, less than that, 2 minutes flying away at 100 knots, because it was just, the range was just off the end of the runway. And Eric he was in the front left-hand seat, and he kept turning around looking at me, and I was giving him a sort of a thumbs up, but his face was looking aghast. And
Yeah.
And I thought, why is he going to Thumb Rate? There's no sick quarters, no helicopter. There's sick quarters, but there's no ambulance. No hospital. Mm. So he did that for a bit. He looked at me. Then I saw him speak to the pilot, and he turned left into this wind, this 25-knot wind over the desert. And I was shit scared that he was going to crash. It was vibrating.
Yeah.
We were heading off towards Salalah, 50 miles away. We were probably covering the ground at round about 100 knots. He was going flat out, as low as he could. I was cursing the fact that my demonstration had been ruined by this bomb, and I felt like saying, I told you so. We should have used 1,000-pounders, but that was for later. And anyway, I suddenly started to feel very tired, and I wanted to get rid of my Mae West, which had a metal catch on it, and you had to pull one and push it down. And the guy sitting next to me, I looked at him as if to say, come and sit here, because I couldn't undo it. My fingers were not very good. And he knelt down in front of me, and I told him how to push this. And he took this partly melting Mae West off me, and he was crying. And I'm going, you feel like, what are you crying for? I'm the one that should be crying here. But he was very emotional, this guy. He wanted to help, but he couldn't sort of, I didn't want him to touch me. Eric kept saying to him like this, don't bother. There's nothing you could do, really. So I was very angry at this stage. I think it was the anger that kept me conscious.
Yeah.
And then after about, it seemed like an age, the helicopter, it was only about 15, 20 minutes. I thought, I'm going to lie down here, and I'm going to have to lie down. And I moved the guy sat on the floor, and I was going to lie down backwards. But every time I did that, it hurt my shoulders at the back for some reason. It was burns there as well. So I thought, no, I'm going to have to do something. And I felt giddy. I thought I was going to faint. And the helicopter pushed over this 1,500-foot high escarpment, and it was literally vertical in places. We go through it on a road down to the coast. And I knew that by then we were only just a few minutes away from Salalah, which is over on the right, about 8 kilometers away. So I sort of brightened up then, and as it pushed over like this, and it went whizzing down towards the plane at Salalah, and he came in at high speed into a sliding stop by the hospital area, and I could see people in white and a big army guy and then there was a what do they call them? Trolley where you put them on. And sick quarter trolley. And Eric jumps out, and he's outside, and he doesn't touch me, and I sort of stumble out of this helicopter and start walking towards this stretcher on wheels. And this army guy runs towards me. He's about 6'3", massive guy. He was the surgeon, actually. And I nearly get to it, and Eric's saying, don't touch him, don't touch him. It's really amazing. And he didn't take the slightest bit of it. He put his shoulder in, he put me over his shoulder and dumped me on this trolley bed, and started running into the building. I remember going along the corridor. My wife and 3 sons were visiting, the only visit, and they'd been there for 3 days. Right. And they actually heard the airplane explosion.
Oh, wow.
So it was a bit... And as I was running along, as I took off actually that morning with the bombs on board, I could see my three sons. He was 13, 11 and 8. 10 and 8. And they were waving down as I climbed away to go above Rubka. Anyway, Eric's running alongside. Everything is seizing up now. My hands and arms were somehow.
Pain's kicking in, I suppose.
Hey?
The pain's kicking in, is it?
Yeah, and everything was just sort of stiffening up. And I remember shouting to him and saying, "Don't use any more of those bombs. Don't use any more of those beep beep bombs."
Professional to the end.
And tell Judy I'm all right. And I'd survived basically. And then I went into this surgery, this big light above my head, and this guy that had picked me up, he's now in white, and I was saying, "Give me an injection, give me an injection," because my nose was flared and my lips were flared, and Eric was standing again in this place next to me, and I'm saying, "Give me an injection, give me an injection," and this guy, Eric, then said, "Give him an injection, give him an injection." Orders from the air.
Yeah.
And this guy leaned over and was looking in my eyes with a light.
Yeah.
He was trying to see if I'd been unconscious because he couldn't give me injection without it, right?
Yeah.
Or if I had. And as he put his right ear close to my mouth, looking in my right eye, because he was on my left, I said, "I haven't been unconscious, beep, beep, give me an injection." And he did.
Hello.
Hello. Have you woken up now after all that noise and all that wittering for 40 minutes?
We're now back in Weston-super-Mare because we forgot to do the end bit. Probably because of fatigue from Rick going on. Please,
he was snoring. Public, he was snoring.
Please come back for, oh God, was it chapter 1, chapter 3?
Chapter 3.
Where Rick will continue with his yarn about
having told this guy to give me an injection.
That's it, yeah. That is a medical ejection.
Yeah. Injection.
So yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Really hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe and
subscribe, what does that mean?
That means like click on it and say you really love it, because it's all, is it, I don't know if anyone's listening to it. Yeah, do all that stuff, but please return. The next installment is when we can do it. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast, and goodbye from myself and
goodbye from Rick.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.